Okay, so let's unpack this. We have a huge stack of notes here today about a book that, honestly, if you just saw it sitting on a shelf, you might find it a bit intimidating.
Oh, absolutely. It is heavy.
Physically
heavy.
Right. It's dense. It's packed with these complex diagrams of walking cycles, charts about timing, and just endless pages of stick figures and construction lines. It really looks like a graduate-level textbook for people who want to work at Pixar or Disney.
It is exactly that. It's often called the Bible of the animation industry for a very good reason. If you walk into literally any animation studio in the world, from Los Angeles to Tokyo, I guarantee you will find a copy of the Animator's Survival Kit by Richard Williams on the desks. It is the gold standard.
But, and I guess this is why we are doing a deep dive on it today, if you actually open the cover and read the introduction, specifically the first chapter titled Why This Book, it doesn't read like a textbook at all.
Not at all.
It reads like a thriller, or like a confession. Because this isn't just a basic how-to guide on drawing cartoons. It's the result of this desperate, decades-long rescue mission.
That is the perfect way to frame it. A rescue mission for a dying language. You know, we tend to think of animation as this thriving, massive industry today with things like Frozen and Spider-Verse and high-end video games.
Right, it's everywhere.
Yeah, but the specific knowledge, the quote-unquote old knowledge, that makes a drawing truly feel alive, that was almost entirely lost. It was actively dying out.
So today, we're going to explore the incredible backstory of this book. We're going to look at how Richard Williams, who most people might know as the guy who directed the animation for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, a 3-time Oscar winner, how he realized at the absolute height of his career that he was actually a fraud.
Fraud is a strong word, but to be fair, it's the exact word he would use to describe himself at that time. It's a fascinating story about hubris, deep humiliation, and then this incredible pivot to basically becoming a beginner student again at age 40.
And we're also going to trace the history of animation itself, which Williams calls drawing in time. We're going to go back way further than Mickey Mouse. We're going back to the caves, actually. We're going to look at why humans are so obsessed with making static images move, and why it is so much harder than it looks.
It's all about the search for the illusion of reality. And to understand why that search is so incredibly difficult, we really have to start with Richard Williams himself, because his personal journey perfectly mirrors the history of the entire medium.
Yeah, let's set the scene a bit. Richard Williams, like we said, most listeners know him as the Roger Rabbit guy. But long before that, back in the 1950s and 60s, he was already a really big deal.
He was a total prodigy. He started drawing seriously when he was just 10 years old. He bought this book called How to Make Animated Cartoons by Nat Falk, which was published back in 1940. And interestingly enough, he says he still used that exact same childhood book as a reference guide 40 years later when he was directing Roger Rabbit.
That is wild to me. The fact that a book he bought for a few cents as a kid contained information fundamental enough to support a massive Hollywood blockbuster in the late 80s.
It just shows that the core principles of movement don't change. Gravity is gravity. But Williams didn't stay a kid copying out of a book. He grew up and became an artist. And I mean artist with a capital A. He was living in Spain, he was a painter, and he viewed animation not as Saturday morning entertainment, but as high art.
He talks about his first major film, The Little Island. He self-financed this whole thing. It came out in 1958. And the way he describes it is, well, it's not exactly Looney Tunes. He calls it a half-hour philosophical argument without words.
Which, let's be honest, sounds incredibly intense.
Very intense.
Imagine sitting in a theater for 30 straight minutes, watching a philosophical argument set to music with zero dialogue. But here's the thing, it worked. The critics absolutely loved it. It won a BAFTA. It won awards at the Venice Film Festival. Williams was basically the toast of the London art scene.
He felt like a true revolutionary.
He did. And you have to understand the context of the late 50s here. The golden age of Disney and Warner Brothers was kind of fading. That old realistic, lush style was starting to be seen as kitsch. It was granddad stuff. The new cool thing was the UPA-style minimalist, abstract, very design-heavy, things like Gerald McBoyne, Boing. Williams was riding that exact wave. He thought he was reinventing the wheel. He looked at the old Disney stuff and thought, oh, that's cute, but I'm doing something important.
And that arrogance is really crucial to the story. Because the higher you fly, the harder you fall. And Williams had what we're calling the Bambi moment.
Oh man, the Bambi moment. This is such a visceral turning point in his life.
So you have to picture this. Williams is the avant-garde master. He's feeling great about himself, winning awards. And he decides to go see a theatrical re-release of Disney's Bambi.
Right, and remember his mindset. He went in with his nose completely in the air. He thought it was going to be conventional. He expected to see cute little animals and sugary sentimentality. He was fully ready to mock it, or at least view it, with this ironic, detached, artistic superiority.
And what actually happened when the lights went down?
He was absolutely devastated. He says, and I'm quoting him here because the imagery is just so strong, he almost crawled out of the theater on his hands and knees.
Crawled out? I mean, that is a physical reaction to a movie.
It was a total shock to his system because he really looked at the movement of those deer. He looked at the way they transferred weight when they stepped over a log, the articulation of the joints, the gravity of it all. He realized that when a deer in Bambi moves, it's not just a flat graphic moving across a painted background. It's a biological creature. It has muscles, bones, and actual weight, and it's interacting with the physical environment.
And he realized he couldn't do that.
He realized he couldn't even begin to do that. He had all the artistic freedom in the world. He could draw whatever wild, abstract shapes he wanted, but he realized he completely lacked the technical knowledge to make something believable. He knew what he wanted to say, but he didn't have the fluency in the language of movement to actually say it.
It's kind of like a poet realizing they don't actually know grammar, or a composer realizing they don't know how to read sheet music.
Exactly. He realized he was a fraud. He had been winning all these awards for his style, but under the hood, he didn't know the basic mechanics of his own craft. He said he learned just enough from watching Bambi to realize he knew absolutely nothing.
That is imposter syndrome hitting a successful professional like a freight train. So what does he do? Because he obviously doesn't quit.
No, he tries to teach himself. He goes into this frantic, almost obsessive mode of self-education. He starts tracing. He manages to get his hands on some original film strips from Ken Harris. Now, Ken Harris was the master animator at Warner Brothers. He was Chuck Jones's lead guy, the animator who did the definitive Bugs Bunny and Wile E. Coyote stuff. Williams is literally in his studio tracing frames of a witch from a Bugs Bunny cartoon, frame by grueling frame, just to understand the spacing.
He's trying to reverse engineer the magic.
He is, but he admits in the book that he was still fighting his own ego during this period. He mentions that he actively avoided another famous animation book at the time, Preston Blair's How to Animate Film Cartoons.
Why would he avoid it if he was so desperate to learn?
Because the drawings on the cover were in that squashy, stretchy, cute 1940s style. Williams still had that lingering modernist prejudice. He hated that style. He thought it was visually ugly. But later he realized that by rejecting the drawing style, he was actually rejecting the underlying principles of physics and movement that the style represented.
And the irony there, of course, is that 40 years later, he becomes world famous for Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is literally the ultimate celebration of that exact squash and stretch style.
Precisely. But he had to seriously humble himself to get there. There's another key moment he describes in this crisis of confidence period involving the Jungle Book, and I think this is where the distinction between graphic design and acting performance really clicked for him.
Right, he compares two specific movies in the book, Yellow Submarine and The Jungle Book.
It is a perfect comparison. So, Yellow Submarine is the Beatles movie. It is a visual feast. It's psychedelic. It's pop art. It's incredibly stylish. Williams went to see it, and he really admired the design. But he noticed something strange about the audience in the theater.
What did he notice?
He saw them checking out. After about 25 minutes, people started getting restless. They were chatting. They were going to the lobby for popcorn. They just weren't engaged with the screen anymore.
Why? I mean, if it looks so cool and different, why weren't they watching?
Because the animation was what Williams calls start-stop. It was jerky. It relied entirely on graphic design moving around the screen rather than fluid, continuous movement. It didn't have any real weight. And because the characters didn't have weight, the audience couldn't empathize with them physically. You can only look at pretty pictures flashing by for so long before your brain gets bored.
And then, almost the exact same week, he goes to see Disney's The Jungle Book.
And again, he goes in reluctantly. He's still fighting his prejudice against Disney. But then he sees this one scene. It's the scene where Mowgli acts alongside Bagheera the panther.
I know exactly the scene. The panther is trying to get the boy to walk, kind of nudging him and pushing him up a tree.
Yes. And Williams describes the scene with such reverence. He watched the panther. He saw the loose skin sliding over the shoulder blades as the animal walked. He saw the sheer weight of the beast as it braced its back legs to push the boy. He saw the friction between the paws and the tree branch. It wasn't just a clever drawing of a panther. It was a heavy, living, breathing creature.
And the audience responds.
They were totally glued to the screen. Nobody was going out for popcorn. They weren't looking at art anymore. They were watching a compelling performance.
He mentions the tiger, Shere
Yeah.
Khan, in that same section too.
That's a massive insight for him. He points out that Shere Khan, the tiger, weighed 800 pounds on the screen. You could feel that weight. But he was also essentially the actor George Sanders who provided the voice. The animator, who was Milt Kahl, managed to combine the heavy anatomy of a real tiger with the sophisticated, incredibly bored, arrogant personality of George Sanders. Williams realized right then that he didn't just need to learn how to draw well, he needed to learn how to act through the pencil.
So he went back to his studio in a state of shock and wrote a fan letter.
A very long, desperate fan letter addressed to Milt Kahl.
Milt Kahl. Let's talk about him for a second because he's a giant in this field. He was one of the 9 old men, right?
Yes, the 9 old men were the core group of master animators at Disney who basically invented the art form as we know it today. Milt Kahl was universally considered the finest draftsman of the entire group. He was the heavy hitter. Williams just assumed Milt did everything he liked in the Jungle Book. It actually turned out Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston did a lot of it too, but Milt was the one who replied to the letter.
And Milt told him something that basically became the cornerstone of Williams's entire philosophy going forward.
He did. Milt told him, "Our animation differs from anyone else's because it is believable. Things have weight. We're giving the illusion of reality."
The illusion of reality. That really is the key phrase of this whole deep dive.
It really is.
Yeah.
Notice he didn't say realism. It's not about photorealism. A cartoon panther like Bagheera doesn't look like a photograph of a panther, but it moves like one. It obeys the laws of physics, or at least it obeys a caricatured version of physics that feels completely real to the human brain.
And this realization kicks off the actual rescue mission because Williams looked at the calendar and realized a pretty terrifying fact. These guys, Milt Kahl, Ken Harris, Grim Natwick, were old. They were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s.
And worse, they hadn't written anything down. The entire studio system was an oral tradition. You learn how to animate by sitting at a desk next to a master for 10 years and watching what they did. But as the old studio system collapsed and cheap television animation took over, nobody was sitting next to the masters anymore. The chain of knowledge was completely broken. Williams realized that when these men died, the secrets of how to create that illusion of reality would literally die with them.
So he did something radical. He decided to just go ahead and hire his teachers.
Which is a brilliant, if incredibly expensive, move. Remember, he was running a very successful commercial studio in London by this point, doing high-end commercials and movie title sequences. He used the profits from his business to fly these absolute legends out to London and pay them to teach him and his staff.
Who exactly did he bring over?
It's basically an Avengers-level lineup of animation history. He brought Ken Harris, the Warner Brothers ace we mentioned. He brought Art Babbitt.
Art Babbitt, he created Goofy, didn't he?
He developed the character of Goofy, yes. But he also animated the famous mushroom dance in Fantasia. He was an absolute master of synchronizing classical music and movement. Williams says Babbitt held these month-long seminars at his London studio that were like water in the desert for him and his young crew.
And then there's Grim Natwick. I just love that name, by the way. Grim Natwick.
It sounds exactly like a character from a fairy tale. And Grim was 83 years old when Williams hired him. He was the man who created Betty Boop back in the 1930s, and he was the lead animator on Snow White herself.
And Williams hired him as a live-in tutor, is that right?
Can you even imagine that? You invite the man who animated Snow White to literally live in your house. Grim was physically frail by that point, but Williams said his hands were as steady as a rock. He would sit there drawing at the light table, and Williams would just sit next to him, watching everything. How he held the pencil, how he flipped the paper, how he thought. It was total immersion.
That shows a level of dedication or maybe obsession that is hard to wrap your head around. But let's zoom in on Ken Harris for a minute, because the relationship between Richard Williams and Ken Harris is really the emotional core of this entire first chapter of the book.
It really is. It's a classic sorcerer and apprentice dynamic, but with a great twist. Because the apprentice is a wealthy 40-year-old studio head who already has Oscars on his shelf.
So Williams brings Ken Harris to London in 1967. And he's trying to learn articulation. He's trying to learn that snappy Warner Brothers secret sauce.
And for a long time, he just couldn't get it. He was trying way too hard. He was overanalyzing every single drawing. He says after 7 or 8 years, and really think about that, 7 or 8 years of intensive study, Ken finally looked at his work and said, hey, Dick, you're starting to draw those things in the right place.
And then came the ultimate validation. He told him, you could be an animator.
Yeah, and then later upgrading it to you could be a good animator, coming from a guy like Ken Harris, that was literally like being knighted by the king.
But there's one specific story about their relationship in the book that I think perfectly captures the whole dynamic between them. The napping story.
Oh, this is essential. This story is hilarious, but it's also profoundly deep. So later in their relationship, Ken Harris is 82 years old. He's retired and living in a trailer home in Ojai, California. Williams would fly all the way out there from London just to work with him.
Just picture the scene. In Southern California, it's hot, it's a trailer park. You have this high-energy, neurotic British director sweating over a light table in a cramped space.
Right. And Ken Harris, being 82, needs his rest. So he would take a nap on the couch while Williams worked. Williams describes spending 3 entire hours meticulously animating a single scene. He's sweating, he's erasing, he's redrawing every line. He finally leans back and thinks, I've got it, this is perfect. This is finally going to impress the old man.
And then the master wakes up.
Ken wakes up, groggy, probably wipes the sleep from his eyes. He shuffles over to the desk. He looks at the scene Williams just spent 3 grueling hours on. He doesn't flip the paper to see the motion. He doesn't study the line work. He just glances at the top drawing and instantly says, hey, that's wrong. You've made a mistake.
That had to be absolutely crushing.
It was infuriating. And Ken was right, of course. He spotted a subtle spacing error instantly, just on instinct. Williams just completely loses it. He explodes. He yells at him, damn it, Ken, I've worked with you for 13 years and I still can't get your thing. It's gonna die with you.
That's the real fear speaking right there. The fear that this entire rescue mission he's dedicated his life to has failed.
Exactly. He's terrified. The knowledge is gone. And Ken's response to this outburst is just perfect. He snickered and said, yeah, well, don't worry, you've your own pretty good thing going.
That is devastatingly cool. Basically saying, yeah, my specific genius is probably going to die with me, but you're doing okay, kid.
It's a great moment. But that exchange actually leads Williams to a really profound realization about the difference between raw talent and mechanical craft. He tells this old Zen story in the book to explain the difference.
Right, the story about the wrestler.
Yes. So a young wrestler learns 99 tricks from an old master. The young guy gets cocky. He thinks he knows everything the master knows. Plus, he has youth and brute strength on his side. So he publicly challenges the master to a match. He says, I'm going to mincemeat you.
And the fight happens.
And the master throws him out the window,
Yeah.
just defeats him instantly without breaking a sweat. The young wrestler is lying there in the dirt, completely confused, and he asks, how did you do that? I knew all your tricks. And the master simply says, I used trick number 100.
So applying that to our topic in this analogy, what exactly is the book?
The book itself, the Animator Survival Kit, is the 99 tricks.
It's the mechanics.
Exactly. The book gives you the scales, it teaches you the physics, the timing, the spacing, how a knee joint bends. But the 100th trick? That's talent. That's the spark of life. You simply cannot teach talent.
And Williams is very honest and clear about this. He's not promising that if you read his book, you'll automatically be a genius.
No, not at all. But he makes a critical argument here. He says, talent without the 99 tricks is completely helpless. It has no way to express itself clearly.
He uses a music analogy for this that I found really, really helpful.
It's probably the most accurate comparison you can make. Animation is exactly like playing a piano. If you are a pianist and you have to constantly look down at your fingers to find the right notes if you have to consciously think, okay, middle C is here, F sharp is over there, you cannot actually perform the emotion of the music. You are just manually operating a machine.
The mechanics have to become completely subconscious.
They have to be, as Williams puts it, in the bloodstream. You have to master the mechanical scales so thoroughly that you can completely forget about them and just play the song. Williams wanted the mechanics of animation to become second nature to the artist so that the animator could finally focus on the actual performance.
Because animation, at its core, is acting.
It is acting. It's just acting with a pencil. There's a great anecdote he shares about the movie actor Scott Wilson. Wilson actually sat in on one of Williams's animation masterclasses. He watched Williams breaking down a basic walk cycle, talking about the character's internal motivation and how that affects their physical weight. And Wilson was blown away. He said, this is the exact equivalent of Stanislavski method acting. It's not about moving drawings around. It's about understanding internal emotional motivation.
There's a brilliant quote from Emery Hawkins, another one of those legendary animators, that really sums this whole concept up. Williams was frustrated one day and said to him, "I'm afraid my brains are in my hand."
And Emery just looked at him and replied, where else would they be?
It's a language of drawing, it's not a language of tongue.
That is the ultimate philosophy of the craft. You have to bypass the verbal, intellectual part of your brain entirely and get the intelligence directly into your muscles.
So we've thoroughly covered the personal journey, the why this book section. Now let's pivot a bit to the second half of our deep dive. Because Williams shifts from his own personal struggle to the broader history of the medium itself. He titles this chapter, Drawing in Time.
And he starts this section with a very basic, very human question. Why do we even do this? Why do we sit in dark, lonely rooms drawing thousands and thousands of pictures just to make a few seconds of film? It's incredibly labor-intensive, it's expensive, it's painfully slow.
So what's the answer? Why do it?
It's the hook. It's the undeniable magic of taking static images, stills, and leaping into a completely different dimension. The dimension of time.
He breaks down the evolution of this magic into 3 distinct stages. And I thought this was a fantastic way to visualize the progress of the art form over history.
It is. So stage 1 is simply drawings that walk. Just seeing a flat drawing spring to life and walk across a screen is fascinating all on its own. It triggers something very primal in our brains. We love seeing movement.
Then you get stage 2, drawings that walk and talk.
Which was a massive, startling experience for audiences when it first happened with sound films. Suddenly the drawing has a literal voice, it commands the room.
And then we reach stage 3, which is the holy grail, drawings that walk, talk, and think.
That is the real aphrodisiac. That is the ultimate magic trick. When a drawing appears to be going through a genuine internal thinking process, when you can see a character hesitate or change its mind or feel sudden fear before they react, that creates deep empathy. That's the exact moment when the audience completely stops seeing a cartoon and starts seeing a living soul.
But humans have been trying to do this long before we had film cameras or computers. Williams takes us way back in time.
Way back. He makes a compelling argument that the history of animation isn't actually the history of film at all. It's the history of human perception. He starts his timeline 35,000 years ago, deep in the caves.
The ancient cave paintings.
Right. Archaeologists have found these incredible drawings of boars and bison on cave walls, but the animals were drawn with 4 pairs of legs instead of just 4 legs.
Like a blur of motion, like a comic book speed line.
Exactly. For years, people just thought these were messy drawings, or maybe someone made a mistake and drew over it. But Williams argues, and many art historians actually agree with him now, that this was a deliberate attempt at animation. Imagine you're standing in a dark, damp cave. The only light source is a flickering fire. The flames are dancing rapidly. If you look at that 8-legged boar in the flickering light, the legs actually appear to move. The beast looks like it's running across the wall.
That is incredible to think about. They were using the natural environment to animate the static image.
Then he moves forward to the Egyptians around 1600 BC. The Temple of Isis. This is honestly one of my favorite details in the whole book.
Oh, the columns. I loved this part.
Yes. So this temple had a long row of massive, closely spaced columns. Painted on each column was a figure of the goddess Isis. But she wasn't painted in the exact same pose on every column. On the first column, her arm is resting down. On the second, it's slightly raised. On the third, it's a bit higher.
So it's a progressive sequence.
It's a perfect sequence. And Williams theorizes that this was essentially drive-by animation. If you were a pharaoh or a high priest riding past those columns in a fast chariot and you looked at the art, the parallax effect would make the images blur together perfectly. You would actually see the goddess raise her hand to bless you as you rode by.
It's like a zoetrope the size of a whole building.
It just proves that the desire to see our creations move is completely inherent in human nature. We just had to wait thousands of years for the technology to finally catch up to the desire.
The Greeks did something similar too, right? On their pottery.
Right. They would paint figures of runners or athletes in sequential poses around a base. You spin the pot on a wheel and the figures appear to run around it.
But eventually we needed actual machines to take the next step, so we get into the era of optical devices. This is where science starts to unlock the magic in a real way.
It starts with the magic lantern in 1640, which used lenses and light to project drawings onto a wall. But the big scientific breakthrough, the actual thing that makes movies physically possible, came from a guy named Peter Mark Rahe in 1824.
Roget, as in the guy who wrote Roget's Thesaurus.
The very same guy. He was a brilliant polymath. He presented a scientific paper to the Royal Society called The Persistence of Vision with regard to moving objects.
Break that concept down for us. What exactly is persistence of vision?
It's a biological quirk of the human eye and brain. When you see an image, your retina actually retains that image for a tiny fraction of a second after the image is physically gone.
Sort of like a visual echo.
Exactly like an echo. So if I show you a picture, then take it away, then show you another slightly different picture very quickly, your brain blends them together to fill the gap. Without that specific biological quirk, movies simply wouldn't work. We would just see a series of annoying, flashing strobe lights. We wouldn't perceive continuous motion.
So Roget explained the science behind it, and that triggered this huge boom in Victorian parlor toys. These are the little devices that directly paved the way for modern cinema.
The philosophical toys, as they called them back then.
The first one he mentions is the thaumatrope.
The Wonder Turner. It's a very simple device. Just a cardboard disc on a string. You draw a bird on one side and a bird cage on the other. You twirl the string, the disc spins really fast, and your brain merges the two images. The bird appears to be trapped inside the cage.
Then came the phenakistoscope.
This was a big step up. It was a spinning disc with vertical slits cut into the edges. You hold it up and look through the slits into a mirror. The slits act exactly like a shutter on a modern camera, freezing the image for a split second so it doesn't just look like a blur. Suddenly, you could have a continuous moving loop of a guy juggling or a couple dancing.
And then the zoetrope. This is probably one everyone knows or has seen in a museum. The spinning cylinder with the slits.
The Wheel of Life. It used the exact same shutter principle as the phenakistoscope, but because it was a drum, multiple people could stand around and watch it at the exact same time. It became a shared experience.
But the really big leap forward, according to Williams, was the praxinoscope, invented by Emile Reynaud in 1877.
This was a crucial evolution. Reynaud improved the basic zoetrope by putting mirrors in the center instead of making you look through slits, which made the image much brighter and clearer. But his real game-changing innovation was something he called the crystalloid.
Crystalloid, what was that?
It was a clear, transparent substance. He figured out that he could paint the moving characters on the transparent strip and then place a separate stationary background behind it. This meant he didn't have to painstakingly redraw the complex background every single time the character moved a millimeter.
Oh, wow. That's the literal birth of animation cells and layers.
It is. It's the foundation of the whole industry. And it allowed him to project much longer sequences of dramatic action, not just a repetitive 2-second loop. He could actually start to tell a tiny story.
But despite all those complex machines, the simplest device, and the one Williams says is still the most important tool for working animators today, is the humble flipper book.
The flip book. It was patented in 1868. It's brilliant because it's the most direct tactile connection between the artist's hand and the resulting motion. Williams notes that even today, or at least when he wrote the book before digital, to completely over-classical animators use this method constantly. Before they ever shoot a scene on camera, they hold the thick stack of drawings in one hand and flip them with the other.
Rolling the drawings, I think it's called.
Right, rolling. Because if the movement feels good and weighty in your hand when you flip the paper, it will absolutely look good on the cinema screen. If it feels clunky or floaty in the flip, it will look clunky on film. It gives the artist immediate, visceral feedback.
So we have all these toys, and then right at the turn of the 20th century, we finally get actual film cameras. And we meet the true pioneers of the medium.
The people who took these parlor tricks and transformed them into cinema, it really starts with a guy named James Stewart Blackton in 1896. He was a newspaper cartoonist who was sent to do an interview with Thomas Edison.
Imagine being the guy assigned to interview Thomas Edison.
Right, and Edison, who was working on early motion picture cameras, was really impressed by how incredibly fast Blackton could sketch on a board. He asked him to do some quick drawings for this new camera to capture. The eventual result of that meeting is a short film called Humorous Phases of Funny Faces in 1906.
The flickering drawings.
Yeah, it was mostly a novelty. It was basically a chalkboard where chalk faces would magically appear, roll their eyes, and change expression. People loved it, but mostly just because it was a magic trick. They were just amazed, saying, look, the picture on the wall is moving.
Then a few years later comes Émile Cole in France.
Cole was much more sophisticated. He was a caricaturist working at the Folies Bergère in Paris. He made what is considered the first real animated film with a cohesive plot. But Cole had a personal motto that I think, brilliantly defines the entire medium of animation forever.
What was his motto?
He said, "Don't do what a camera can do what a camera can't do."
That is a fantastic rule. I mean, if you can just film it with real actors on a street, why spend months drawing it?
Exactly. Animation shouldn't just be poor man's live action. It should be reserved for the impossible, for metamorphosis, for visual magic, for extreme caricature that breaks reality.
But the first true master of the form, the guy who really elevated it from a cheap magic trick to an undeniable art form, was Winsor McCay.
Winsor McCay is the godfather, full stop. He was an already famous, brilliant comic strip artist. He drew Little Nemo in Slumberland for the newspapers, which is just a masterpiece of forced perspective, surrealism, and architectural imagination.
And he saw animation as high art from the very beginning.
He absolutely did. He was an obsessively hard worker. For his very first animated film, which was an adaptation of Little Nemo, he hand drew 4,000 individual frames. He even hand-painted the colors on the tiny film strip himself.
But his real breakthrough, the one that completely changed everything for the medium, was Gertie the dinosaur in 1914. And we really need to explain why Gertie was so fundamentally different, because it wasn't just a movie you sat and watched, was it?
No, it was actually designed as a live vaudeville act. This is so fascinating. McCay would tour theaters with the film. He would stand on the live stage in a full tuxedo holding a whip right next to the movie screen. He would introduce Gertie to the crowd as the only living dinosaur in captivity.
And he would actually interact with the projection.
Yes. He'd shout commands at the screen. He'd say, "Gertie!" bow to the audience. And on the screen, the animated dinosaur would look out and shyly bow. Then he'd say, "Gertie, lift your right foot." And she would look stubborn, maybe shake her head a bit, and then slowly lift her foot.
So she had a real personality. She wasn't just a moving robot.
That is the massive breakthrough. She was shy, she was hungry, she got distracted, she was disobedient. McCay would even do this incredible trick where he'd hold up a real cardboard apple on the physical stage, then pretend to toss it behind the movie screen. At that exact second, a drawn apple would appear on the screen and catch right in Gertie's mouth.
Split-second timing required for that to work live.
It had to be flawless. But the audience was astounded, and not just by the technical trick, but by the character. They genuinely fell in love with the drawing of a dinosaur. That was the exact moment animation became acting.
So McCay proved animation could be funny and endearing. Then, a few years later, with the sinking of the Lusitania in 1918, he proved it could be deadly serious.
That film was essentially the first animated documentary. The passenger ship Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat, which helped push America into World War I. Obviously, there were no news cameras out in the ocean to film it. So McCay animated the entire tragic event. It was dark, it was realistic, it was highly dramatic. It took him 2 full years and 25,000 drawings to finish. It proved once and for all that animation could handle deep tragedy.
But then there's a really sad twist with McCay's life at the end. He ended up hating what the industry became.
He was a pure idealist. He saw animation as fine art. Later in his life, in the 1930s, a group of studio animators invited him to a big dinner in his honor. He actually stood up at the table and told them, "I created a great art form, and you have turned it into a crude, money-making business."
Ouch. That is the eternal battle between art and commerce right there.
It really is. But the hard truth is that that crude money-making business is exactly what allowed the art form to scale up and evolve. And that brings us right into the industrialization of animation, the golden age.
Enter Walt Disney.
Right. Now, Disney didn't invent animation, obviously, but he perfected the factory assembly line of it without losing the artistic quality. In fact, he figured out how to use the assembly line structure to actively increase the quality.
We see this incredibly rapid evolution under Disney in the late 20s and 30s. Steamboat Willie in 1928 brought fully synchronized sound to the public.
Which changed everything. Suddenly, Mickey stomps his foot and you instantly hear a loud thump on the soundtrack. That audiovisual connection creates a profound sense of physical weight.
Then the skeleton dance, coordinated complex action with a pre-recorded musical score. Flowers and trees brought full Technicolor.
And then the Three Little Pigs in 1933 brought personality animation to a totally new level.
How so? How is it different from Gertie?
Well, you have these 3 pigs, and graphically they look almost entirely identical, but they move completely differently from one another. They act differently based on their internal psychological character. One is frivolous and bouncy, one is cautious and stiff. You could tell who was who just by how they stood. That was a huge, huge leap in animation acting.
And all of this rapid innovation culminates in what you could call the moon landing of animation Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937.
It is genuinely hard to overstate what a massive gamble that movie was. People in Hollywood openly called it Disney's folly. They thought he was financially insane. The conventional wisdom was, sure, people will laugh at a 6-minute cartoon before a movie, but they won't sit through 80 minutes of drawings. The bright colors will physically hurt their eyes. They'll get bored, they'll get up, and they'll leave the theater.
But they didn't leave.
No, they sat there completely mesmerized. At the end of the film, when Snow White dies, or appears to die, grown men were openly weeping in the movie theater. They actually had to book appointments at hospitals for people to recover from the emotional intensity of a cartoon.
That permanently proved that hand-drawn characters could carry a dramatic feature film just as well as human actors.
It fully established the golden age. For the next decade or so, with films like Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi animation, reached a level of technical and artistic perfection that was basically unmatched.
But then, the fall. What exactly happened to break that momentum?
Two major things. First, World War II disrupted the studios heavily. But the real disruptor, the absolute asteroid that hit the animation planet, was television.
The voracious appetite of the TV schedule.
Exactly. TV needed content. And it needed it fast, and it needed it incredibly cheap. You couldn't spend 4 years and millions of dollars making a Snow White for TV. You had to crank out a new half-hour episode every single week on a shoestring budget.
This is where we see the rise of the UPA studios and things like Mr. Magoo, the Flintstones, the whole Hanna-Barbera empire.
Stylized, limited animation. Limited animation is the actual technical term for it. To save money, you hold the body completely still and just flap the mouth up and down. You use the exact same walk cycle background over and over again. You design characters to be flat so they are faster to draw.
And look, I grew up on that stuff. I love Scooby-Doo. But Williams argues very passionately that something vital was lost in that transition.
Something huge was lost. The old knowledge of physical weight, nuanced timing, joint articulation, and realism that was so painfully developed by Disney and Warner Brothers was suddenly seen as unnecessary overhead. It was deemed too expensive for TV, so nobody bothered to teach it anymore.
The lineage was completely broken.
Exactly. You had all these new young animators coming into the industry in the 60s and 70s, and they were learning how to draw funny graphic designs, but they weren't learning how to make the move convincingly. The masters, the 9 old men, Ken Harris, Grim Natwick, were retiring or dying off, and the deep secrets of movement were vanishing with them.
And that brings us full circle back to Richard Williams. He looks around, he sees this breakage in the chain, he sees the old masters dying, and he writes this exact book to bridge that gap.
He's trying to hand the torch across that generational gap. He's essentially saying, please don't let this knowledge die. It's too valuable to lose.
And here's where it gets really interesting for us today in our modern context. Because a listener might be thinking, well, everything is 3D now. Everything is computer generated. Who cares about how to draw with a pencil?
But Williams addresses this head on in the Rebirth section at the end of the chapter. He talks about computer animation places like Pixar, DreamWorks, modern gaming. He vividly describes 3D characters as high-tech marionettes.
That's a really good image. Just a digital puppet inside the computer.
But he argues, and by the way, the top folks at Pixar completely agree with him on this, that computers actually need the old knowledge even more than hand-drawn artists did.
Really? Why is that?
Because a computer is just a math machine. If you tell it to move a digital arm from point A to point B, it will do it perfectly. It will interpolate the frame smoothly, robotically. But that perfect smoothness is not life. Life is messy. Life has texture and hesitation. To make a perfect 3D model look like it's actually alive, you need to deeply understand weight, anticipation, squash and stretch, overlapping action, all the exact things that Ken Harris and Milt Kahl perfected with graphite pencils back in the 1940s.
So whether it's drawn on a piece of paper or rigged with bones in Maya, the underlying principles remain exactly the same.
Exactly. The medium constantly changes. We went from cave walls to pottery to celluloid to pixels. But the ultimate goal is always the same, to create that illusion of reality, to make the audience genuinely believe that this artificial construct is thinking and feeling.
It's amazing to think that this heavy textbook, which looks so dry and technical on the outside, is actually a deep philosophy book about life, empathy, and performance.
And a love letter, really. It's a profound love letter to the people who figured it all out before us.
So we've gone from the flickering fires of the caves to the modern computer screen. We've seen Richard Williams crawl out of a movie theater in total shame and rise up to become the ultimate preservationist of the art form.
And I think the biggest takeaway from all this, for me anyway, is a quote from Emery Hawkins that Williams includes right near the end of the chapter. He says, "The only limitation in animation is the person doing it."
There is no limit to what you can do. And why shouldn't you do it?
It's an open invitation. It's him saying, look, the tools are all here. The history is documented. Now go make something move.
I love that. Okay, so for everyone listening, here are your homework for this deep dive. You don't have to go out and animate a feature film, but I want you to watch something a little differently tonight. Go watch The Jungle Book, specifically that Mowgli and Bagheera scene we talked about, or go watch Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
And don't just passively watch the story. Watch the physical weight. Look at how the characters' feet actually touch the ground. Try to look for the thinking happening behind the movement.
Try to spot the brains in the hands.
Yes. And honestly, it changes the way you see the real world, too. Suddenly, you start noticing how real people walk down the street or how you shift your own weight when you stand up from a chair. It's a really fascinating lens to view everyday reality through.
It really does change your perspective.
Yeah.
But, thinking about all this, the mechanics, the physics, the illusion of reality, it leaves me with one final, slightly strange thought.
Oh, what's that?
We talk so much about how animators study human movement to create a believable performance on screen. But what if the way we, as actual humans, move through the world is partly a learned performance too? I mean, with the rise of modern motion capture, we are basically feeding human acting directly into computers, completely bypassing the caricaturist's eye. But without that trick, without the artist deliberately exaggerating reality to make it feel more real than reality, are we eventually going to lose that soul again in the pursuit of pure, perfect digital simulation? Something to chew on.
Oh, that is a whole other deep dive right there.
It definitely is. Well, this has been a fascinating look into Chapter 1 of the Animator Survival Kit. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My absolute pleasure.
See you all in the next one.